Hello, this is Mr. Barth talking about Chapter 7, Hammering Out a Federal Republic. Our essential question here: what was required to make the United States a viable, independent republic, and how did the debates over the Constitution shape relations between the national government and the states? So, we're going to be discussing now the United States is becoming its own country, developing a constitution, and living with that system. So, with the Constitution now put in place, George Washington is elected as the first president. In this current system, John Adams is elected vice president because the second most number of votes becomes vice president. And we have important people in the executive departments: Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of War Henry Knox. Probably one of the most influential and um, one of the biggest cabinets of any president. So when the Constitution was created, it created a Supreme Court, but it was very vague on how the Supreme Court would be set up. They really let Congress decide what that would look like. So Congress passes a law called the Judiciary Act of 1789. It creates federal courts, and you can see there's different regions of the federal courts. There's an eastern region, a middle region, and a southern region. And in the end, there's a Supreme Court that has final say. The Supreme Court's very different from today than it was then. I believe when it first started, there's only 5 justices on the Supreme Court, and they met in the basement of the Capitol. Eventually, um, the Supreme Court would have the final say from other federal courts. With the Constitution, they also created the Bill of Rights. James Madison fought for its inclusion as protections from the government. It includes things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and other limits on the government. Here's just a list of what the Bill of Rights are. We don't need to memorize these. This is something you'll talk about in Foundations of American Democracy class or U.S. Government, AP U.S. Government, if you decide to take those classes. You can see some of the first couple. The first one is different freedoms you might have. And then 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 are rights of people who are accused of crimes. And then 9 and 10 are a little bit about where power is kept. Now, to create this country, Washington is going to depend on his young aide who worked with him since the Revolutionary War, Alexander Hamilton. Now, during the war, the government prints its own money and its own securities, which is like a stock or a bond. But they would actually depreciate in value. So the value of our money is not very great, especially during the war. And during the war, all the states are accruing a lot of debt from the war. It takes a lot of money to pay for soldiers, to pay for ammunition, and pay for food. And so all these states have different war debts. And under Alexander Hamilton's plan, the federal government would assume these war debts. Sometimes you might see this called assumption. And to get this done, Hamilton comes up with an agreement with some opponents in Congress, saying that the new national capital will be located in the South between Virginia and Maryland, and they make that deal. If you've seen or listened to the musical Hamilton, this discussion is in one of the songs. Hamilton continued to build an economic system that would last for a long time by creating the Bank of the United States. You might see it in this PowerPoint or in other places referred to as BUS, B-U-S, Bank of the United States. And so this is basically a bank owned by the national government and private stockholders. So you could own a part of this bank, and this bank could make loans out to businesses. It takes in government money. It issues bills of credit, um, and it's going to be around for 20 years. After 20 years, it has to ask the government again to continue for another 20 years. And while Hamilton really likes this bank, Jefferson and Madison don't like it. They think it's unconstitutional because the Constitution did not explicitly give the government power to do this. Hamilton says that, well, these are discretionary powers under the Constitution. The necessary and proper clause says that the government should do anything that's necessary and proper for the general welfare of the people. And so he is going to implement this Bank of the United States. Jefferson does not like it because he thinks that banks are places where people abuse money and take it from other people. So this graph shows us the amount of debt that that the United States has. Um, there's $42 million in war debt from the government, national government. There's 21 million that were taken from states. There's $11 million owed to other countries. So the United States owes a lot of money, and we need to pay for this somehow. We need to pay off our debts. So how is the government going to pay for all this debt? Well, he doesn't want to pay off the debt completely. So that way, wealthy Americans would be tied to the new national government. So he doesn't want it necessarily to be zero right now, but he does want to pay off the annual interest and pay down some of the loans through two ways. One is an excise tax. An excise tax is a tax on a specific thing, like whiskey. If they put an excise tax on whiskey, it's a tax just on that thing. It's not on anything else. It's just on whiskey. When you buy it, you have to pay a little bit more money. The other thing is through a tariff. So anything coming into the United States, that business or country has to pay a special tax, and that goes right to the national government to pay off their debts. So this is going to help pay off the debt, but it's also going to make sure that the United States is able to keep credit with other countries and with wealthy Americans. Here you can see the amount of money that the United States is getting in through customs revenue. Those are tariffs, and excise, that's taxes, or excise taxes. So the annual interest, so we have this huge $75 million debt. Every year it goes up about $4 million, and we're getting about $5 million in. So we're able to pay off our interest with about $1 million left over. Most Southern politicians do not like this plan. They thought that it is only helping business owners in the North, and so Southerners, led by Madison and Jefferson, lead a new group called the Democratic Republicans. If Jefferson had his way, he would want all Americans to become independent, what he calls yeoman farmers. And basically what that means is a small farmer who has his own land and over time gains more land, has bigger farms, because he believes that's the most simplest and purest way to live. Jefferson himself owns a farm, a plantation farm. However, he also owns over 200 slaves. Now, while this is happening, the French Revolution is going through dramatic changes. The French is going through many transitions as well. They're having its own revolution and would eventually go to war with Great Britain. They've created a constitutional monarchy, so that means a king that has some limits to his power through a constitution. And with this fight between France and Great Britain, many people wondered uh, what would America do? Are we going to join the French because they helped us in the Revolutionary War, or are we going to help the British, who speak the same language as us? And most people believe we would make better business partners with. So who are we going to join? Well, Washington decides to issue a proclamation of neutrality. Um, Americans are able to trade with both sides, and we're not going to fight on other side during the war. Um, this makes Great Britain and France both upset because they both want to trade with us, and they don't want us to trade with the other country. And Americans are split. Who should we support, France or Great Britain? Um, Now, America is neutral, um, and because of um, the because Great Britain and France were upset that we are trading with the other country, they begin to attack our ships. Great Britain starts seizing our American ships, that was going to go to France. And Washington needs to do something about this to stop them from taking over our ships. So he sends John Jay, here he is, to negotiate a treaty with the British. They create a treaty, it becomes known as Jay's Treaty, and it allowed Britain to keep stopping neutral ships, which many Americans say is not great. Um, it also said Americans had to pay pre revolutionary debts. Okay, doesn't sound like it's too great for America yet. What it does do is it says Great Britain has to leave all troops in what's America's land. Even though the war had been over for about 10 years now, there were still British soldiers in places like Illinois and Wisconsin, and Indiana, what is today those states, and this gets those states or the people out of the states. So Jay's Treaty comes back. It's very controversial, and the Democratic Republicans hate the treaty. Um, we talked before about Hamilton's excise taxes. He does put a tax on whiskey. One place in America that distills a lot of whiskey is Western Pennsylvania. And they got so upset by this tax on whiskey that they decided to rebel in protest of the new tax. They were going to rebel and go after the state government and, I don't know, kill people and burn things down. And so Washington was able to raise a militia of 12,000 troops, um, and just the idea of this would disperse the rebels. Um, Meanwhile, on the island of Haiti, um, which was I believe it was a French colony, African slaves there led a massive uprising, killed their slave owners, and got rid of slavery. They took over the whole island, and this scared American Southerners. This was their biggest fear, that their slaves could rise up and kill them in the middle of the night while they're sleeping. And so America um, doesn't want this to happen to the South. They would impose a trade embargo, meaning we're not going to trade with Haiti back and forth, and they're going to implement more rules and laws in the South, um, which makes it more difficult for African American slaves to to organize. They're not allowed to meet together unless it's at church. They're not allowed to read or write. They're not allowed to shoot rifles. In many states, this was already law, but in others, they picked up these laws as well. Here you can see Washington president, but also commander-in-chief, ready to ride out to meet the Whiskey Rebellion. Now, if you remember, there was Shays' Rebellion a few years before this, when there was still the Articles of Confederation, and Shays' Rebellion uh, was going to go after the Massachusetts state government, and the national government wasn't able to respond to it. That was an example of how the Articles of Confederation was not able to respond to a crisis. With this Whiskey Rebellion, this showed that the national government was able to respond to crises much faster, and showed the Constitution was better than the Articles. Americans are more and more divided, especially the politicians. The Federalists and the Democratic Republicans are becoming more and more like a party, a political party. Before this time period, it was just generally people who agreed with each other, but now they're becoming more organized. And in 1796, President Washington decides he's not going to run again. And these two political parties begin organizing to figure out who's going to run for president, how can we get them to win the election. And so they begin having banquets and organizations and meetings to try to get people to like their person that they like. At this time, candidates did not run for president. You didn't go around and give speeches and tell people why you should be president or anything like that. That was seen as like unbecoming of somebody who could be president. Um, you just had to rely on other people to do the work for you. After the votes are counted in the Electoral College, John Adams is elected the second president, and Thomas Jefferson becomes vice president. Now, when Adams becomes president, he's generally following a pro-British foreign policy. There were some issues with France beginning to stop American ships, and so he sent American negotiators to go stop this. And when the negotiators got to France, they were going to try to meet with the French negotiator named Talleyrand. And instead of meeting the negotiator, Americans were met with three mystery men. We don't know who they were, but three mystery men who said they worked for Talleyrand, and they said they had to pay a special fee, special money, in order to negotiate. Because we don't know who they are, it's like in math, we label them as X, Y, and Z. And while this is a pretty common practice to pay to start negotiating, Americans felt this was dishonorable, and they called it the XYZ affair. It made Americans feel more upset about the French, and Congress agreed to stop trading with the French around this time. With Adams as president, the Federalists began fighting any Republicans who were taking a pro-French position. Congress passes the Naturalization Act, which made it, um, uh, instead of taking 5 years, you had to live in 5 years to America to become a citizen. Now you had to live in America for 14 years. And so this limits the amount. There was a lot of French immigrants coming into Pennsylvania during this time period. So this limited how many of those people could become citizens. They also passed the Alien Act, which authorized the deportation of foreigners, and there was a pretty wide ability for the government to basically deport anyone they wanted to. And one of the most controversial acts was the Sedition Act. The Sedition Act would prohibit the publication or the utterance of insults or malicious attacks on politicians. So if you say anything bad about the president, you could be thrown in jail. Even if the statement you say is true, if it's malicious, you could be thrown in jail. Can you imagine what that act would be like today in the United States? Well, anyway, over 20 Democratic Republican reporters and journalists were arrested and put in jail. And some states like Virginia and Kentucky were so against this law, they created resolutions saying that states had a right to judge the constitutionality of national laws. They had a right to say, well, this law is not constitutional, we're not going to follow it. And so this is a really important law, and you should make sure you write those down, because basically it's going to give states the excuse that if they don't like the national government's, their laws or something in the future, that they can just ignore it. And so when we get to the middle 1800s, when the national government is trying to do things that might limit slavery, southern states say, well, we've done it in the past. We said, we don't think this is constitutional, and just ignore it. We're going to see more of that happen later. Now, Adams did not declare war on France, even though many Federalists wanted him to. He instead was able to use diplomacy. They met with the French negotiators, and they were able to end the conflict between the United States and France. So it did not lead to war. Here you can just see some conflict in Europe. I'm sorry, in Congress, with all the fighting in Europe, and the questions about who we should support, the French or the British. Here, there people are fighting with fire tongs and canes, and who knows, maybe that kind of stuff is going to happen in Congress this year. Now, after the Revolutionary War, America said that they owned all the land all the way to the Mississippi River. Now, while we were negotiating the end of the war in Paris and creating a treaty with Great Britain, Native Americans were not invited. We know from previous chapters that the United States or the colonies have been taking land away from Native Americans for quite some time now. In some egregious examples, they used liquor and bribes to take away land. And in many cases, Native Americans would fight against U.S. troops or people moving west and encroaching on their traditional lands. Some of this fighting happened in Ohio. And in 1794, when Washington was still president, he sent troops into Ohio to fight and crush the Native resistance. They ended up creating a treaty called the Treaty of Greenville, and they said that the natives did own the land. They would pay for most of Ohio, and the natives would agree that America has sovereignty or control over the land. And when this happens, more and more Americans are moving across the Appalachian Mountains after the Revolutionary War, leading to Kentucky becoming the 15th state. First one west of the mountains. Here you can see the Treaty of Greenville. This dark green area is land that is given to the United States. Now, in 1800, there's another election. This time, John Adams is running again, and everyone expects that Thomas Jefferson will be competing for the presidency again. Now, as the election is taking place, the remarks and personal attacks against each other are terrible. Here you can see one. Jefferson would create a nation where murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will openly be taught and practiced. And then Adams was a rageful, lying, warmongering fellow who behaved neither like a man nor like a woman, but instead possessed a hideous hermaphroditical character. So, the discussions that presidential candidates have today are obviously mean-spirited and unkind of each other. But it's important to know that this kind of thing also is nothing new in American politics, that this has been happening for 220 years. Now, when the election takes place, John Adams does not win. Instead, all the Democratic Republicans vote the same way, Um, the Electoral College members get 2 votes. So all the Democratic Republicans vote for Jefferson and Aaron Burr. And when there's a tie in the Electoral College, it goes to the House of Representatives to vote on the winner. And if you've listened to the musical before, Hamilton is asked who he supports, Burr or Jefferson. He believes in Jefferson's realness, and he supports Jefferson over Burr. Jefferson wins the vote in the House of Representatives, and so he wins the first peaceful transition of power. This is the first time this has really ever happened in a large country, in even in Europe, where an opposing party transitions power peacefully. In his inaugural address, Jefferson said, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists," trying to hit home the idea of we are all Americans. Now, before Adams left the presidency, Federalists wanted to create a system with people who were Federalists as well. And so what they did was they started posting people into federal judge positions right at the end of Adams' presidency. Democratic Republicans called these midnight judges because they did it at the very end of his term as president. Now, there was one position that they provided for a man, for William Marbury. He was supposed to be a judge, and the new Secretary of State refused to give him the job. And so Marbury would end up suing, and it goes to the Supreme Court. At the Supreme Court, they decide Marbury should have the job. He should be given the job. However, they also say the Supreme Court doesn't have the power to enforce it. They can just all they can do is just say that it's there, but it's up to basically the Secretary of State to listen to that decision. It also it got rid of a section of the Judiciary Act. And so when they did that, when they got rid of that section, this is the first example of the Supreme Court's power to review laws. It's called judicial review, and they can declare that laws are unconstitutional or not. They also said that states can't declare constitutionality, so those Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, they can't do that. When Jefferson becomes president, he does not renew the Alien and Sedition Acts. Instead, they release a lot of the men who were arrested. They're released from prison, and they actually will impeach a Supreme Court justice for taking part in putting men in jail because of the Sedition Acts, which is, I think, the only time a Supreme Court justice has been impeached. They got rid of the excise taxes. They reduced the size of the army. And while they looked at the Bank of the United States, they didn't like it, but they kept it because the system worked. Now, for the last 20 years, in North Africa, there is a group of kind of city-states called the Barbary States. It's like a country that have raided ships in the Mediterranean Sea. And when European ships traveled through there, if they were stopped by the Barbary States, they would have to pay some money to continue. It's a bribe. And the United States did this, and they would pay this annual bribe. Jefferson decides he does not want to pay the bribe anymore, and he wants to declare war on the Barbary States. Eventually, they would sign a peace treaty in 1815, avoiding this war. Now, remember President Jefferson wants Americans to become yeoman farmers. And one way that he wants this to happen is the people to move to the West. If they move further west, there's more land available there. And doubly, that helps him politically because more people moving to the West means more likely those states would be filled with Democratic Republicans, which would give his side more power. Now, leading up to this, Napoleon Bonaparte, who is now in control of France, had recently taken over the Louisiana Territory, which is land west of the Mississippi River, and he had shut Americans out of New Orleans. Jefferson would actually send negotiators to buy New Orleans because it's a very important port city. And Napoleon needs cash. He's in the middle of wars in Europe. He needs money. And so he decides to not only sell New Orleans, but the entire Louisiana Territory. Now, Jefferson, remember, he believes in a strict interpretation of the Constitution, which means he only wants to do things that the Constitution explicitly says is okay. And there's nothing in the Constitution that says a president can buy land. But he just does it anyway, which shows a little bit about Jefferson in that he is willing to be a strict constructionist as long as it works for his political goals. He would send an expedition to explore the Louisiana Territory, led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, and they're going to look for a Northwest Passage. Ever since the trip with Columbus, Europeans have been looking for an all-water route from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. And the Lewis and Clark expedition hopes that there is what's called the Northwest Passage, which is an all-water route that would lead to the Pacific. And so they get on their boats and they travel west. They go up the Missouri River and they go across the Great Plains, and then they get to the Rocky Mountains. Now they're kind of expecting that there's going to be like the Appalachian Mountains, where you get to the very top of the ridge, and you get over, and you see there's this gentle decline down to the Pacific Ocean. However, when they climb up to get to the first ridge of the Rocky Mountains, they get up there, and all they see is more mountains. The Rocky Mountains are a lot bigger than the Appalachian Mountains, and that right there ends the idea of an all-water route across America. Meanwhile, France and Great Britain are still in conflict with each other. What else is new? And they both want America to take their side. What else is new? Both France and Britain are hurting American ships. France starts taking over our ships. Great Britain starts basically impressing or kidnapping American sailors. They kidnap them and make them work on their Navy ships. And then a British ship attacks a U.S. naval ship called the Chesapeake. This is the Chesapeake Affair. Jefferson is so upset by this that he wants to stop trading altogether. He ends all trade to other countries in the embargo of 1807, thinking that this is going to make France and England stop. But he overestimates how important our trade is to those countries. It doesn't actually hurt them very much, but it hurts the United States a lot. So they stopped that. That was a bad plan. And in 1808, another Democratic Republican, James Madison, who was the father of the Constitution, would be elected president of the United States. And this is just a weird political cartoon about. Yeah, we don't even talk about that. Anyway, in the West, Native Americans are still in conflict with Americans who are moving west. One Shawnee war chief named Tecumseh would align himself with other Native Americans in the West, in places like Indiana, and they prepared for war. The U.S. Army was sent out to fight against the Native Americans there, led by this man, William Henry Harrison, who would attack the Native Americans at the Battle of Tippecanoe. William Henry Harrison becomes a war hero, and you'll see throughout this class that Americans love war heroes. So we'll hear from him later. Meanwhile, Great Britain is also trading with these Native Americans. They're seizing American ships, and America is getting more and more upset at the British. Many Westerners are arguing for war with England, feeling like they are spurring on the Native Americans to fight against the Americans. And Madison asked Congress to declare war. Democratic Republicans are on board with fighting in the war. Federalists are a little iffy. And so the two main causes of this War of 1812 is trade and territory. England disrupts trade and they impressed our sailors, and fighting over territory in western United States. They're supposed to be gone now because of the Jay's Treaty, but they're still there. Now, we're not really going to talk too much about the actual fighting of the war. Basically, what we need to know is that the British would invade. We had some victories while we were fighting in Canada, but it really the war really did not go well for the United States. Land battles did not go well. Some naval victories for the United States, but overall, Washington D.C. was attacked and many government buildings were burned down by British soldiers. Many Eastern Americans did not support the war and so wouldn't give money to the government. And the war is dragging on. It did not only take place in 1812. In fact, it lasted a few years. But there was one general named Andrew Jackson who was winning battles in the Southwest. Around this time, the Federalists, who are not in power and who are against the war, they come together in Hartford, Connecticut, to discuss how they want to change the government and change the Constitution. They feel like they don't have any power. And so they say things like the presidency should rotate among the states, meaning if there was one president from Virginia, the next president cannot be from Virginia. They say they should have a higher vote threshold to declare war. They should stop trade embargoes. And they say all these things that they want to happen, but none of it actually does happen. And when that takes place, it shows that the Federalists really don't have any power. And this is going to be the beginning of the end of the Federalist Party. While fighting, Andrew Jackson hears that there is a British force right outside of New Orleans. They want to attack the city, and Jackson is going to defend it. While that's taking place, Great Britain wants peace. They've been fighting in a war against France for 20 years, and their fight against the US doesn't seem worth it anymore. And so they decide to sign a treaty with the United States called the Treaty of Ghent. And it basically brings the borders back to what it was before the war. Basically, they say that, okay, we're just going to be done fighting. We'll stop taking your sailors. So they signed this treaty, this peace treaty. The war is over. But remember, there's no cell phones during this time. There's no internet. It takes weeks and weeks for news to travel across the Atlantic Ocean. It can only go as fast as a boat can. And so news is coming to America that the war is over. But before the news gets there, English troops attack New Orleans and attack General Jackson. But Jackson crushes the British, and he's a national hero, which is kind of funny that he's a national hero for winning a battle that took place after peace was signed. But he's a national hero. Remember, Americans love war heroes. There he is on top of the ramparts at New Orleans. I mentioned before about the Hartford Convention being the end of the Federalist Party. They had no power to change anything. And when more states crop up in the West over the Appalachian Mountains, there's not very many Federalists there. And in the next election, the Federalists are going to lose badly, 16% to 84% in the Electoral College. When this happens, the Democratic Republicans, they kind of split into two smaller groups, one being the National Republicans. They're very similar to the Federalists. Some of the Federalists would actually join the National Republican group. They're led by a man named Henry Clay, and we're going to see a lot of Henry Clay over the next couple chapters. Most of these National Republicans live in New England, and they want things like internal improvements paid by the national government. They want the national government to build new roads and new canals paid by the national government for use of the states and the people. Democratic Republicans, they stay true to Jeffersonian principles. Smaller, limited government, no internal improvements, no standing army, stuff like that. Even though the last few presidents have been Democratic Republicans, the federal court system has been controlled by Federalists. John Marshall has been the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court since 1801, and he is a Federalist. He believes in giving more power to national government than to state governments. We talked about Marbury versus Madison before, that the Supreme Court could overturn laws, even state laws. They also decided that the government should protect property rights in Dartmouth College versus Woodward. And they said that national law has supremacy over state law. They decided that in McCulloch versus Maryland and Gibbons versus Ogden. In 1816, the Democratic Republican James Monroe is elected president. James Monroe is the last Revolutionary War veteran to become president. In fact, he is actually on in the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. If you've seen him with the boat and the flag, James Monroe is actually on the boat. He's a young man at the time. John Quincy Adams, who is the son of the second president, John Adams, would become a negotiator for the United States, and he would negotiate with Spain, called the Adam-Onis Treaty, where Spain would give up Florida, but Spain could have Texas. And Monroe, the really important thing you need to know about Monroe is the Monroe Doctrine. He basically tells Europe to stay away from the Americas, that the American continents are not going to be controlled by Europe anymore. And for the next few years, historians have called this time period the era of good feelings, because there's only one political party, the Republicans, and supposedly there's no conflict. And we'll talk about what that looks like in the next chapter. Thank you.